okay, and I'll try not to look at it.
Okay, so first of all, what church do you attend, and how long have you been going there?
I not only attend, but I'm also on staff at South Weymouth Church of the Nazarene, and I will have been there 3 years.
3 years?
In
Okay.
July.
Can you tell me a little about your denomination's core beliefs?
Well, it's Church of the Nazarene.
Yeah.
So, boy, you put me on the spot now.
Sorry.
Yeah, core beliefs, salvation through Christ, the infilling of the Holy Spirit, we're missional, we're Christian, and we're evangelical, although that's got a lot of baggage attached to it. But that's it in a nutshell.
What is your stance on tolerance and the church's role in dealing with racism? Do you believe that is the church's job to play an active role in fighting against it?
Yes, and we have a multiracial congregation at South Weymouth, which is very refreshing. We have a number of African Americans in the church. We have a mixed couple, well, 2 mixed couples. The wife is Anglo-white and the husband is African American, and they just fit in and blend in and are part of the church, and it's a unique congregation because there is no stigma at all to anybody, and we have another African American family who regularly attends, and it's like a big family, and I'm very amazed that the church is that way.
How do you think it got to be that way?
I'm not really sure. Having only been there 3 years, although I've known some of the pastors over the years, it's a very international looking church. They travel with work and witness teams every other year, so they have more of an international outlook. The senior pastor is Portuguese. He's not a born American. So there's toleration internationally and racially, and I think it's a unique church.
Okay. So how often have you heard a sermon discussing the problem of racism and what the church should be doing to combat it?
I've not heard any sermons on it.
Okay. Why do you think a pastor would refrain from talking about racism?
I think in our church, it doesn't come up as a subject because it isn't viewed as a problem within our congregation. Everybody is so accepting that it's not really been a problem. He's preached about other things, but racism has not been one of those things.
Have you been to a church where that is more of an issue?
I've been to some churches where it seems that it could be. I've not been in any churches long term to really perceive it, but I'm sure it could be a problem.
Okay. Have you been in a church where there was a noticeable lack of diversity or racial tension between the members of the congregation?
I haven't noticed any racial tension, but I've been in a lot of churches where there's lack of diversity. Not so many here in New England. I've been to a number of churches here in New England, and there's a lot of mix in the New England district, for one thing. But out in the Midwest, you go to churches in the Midwest. I grew up in Ohio, and you never saw African American people in the churches out there. I've been to some churches in Virginia, and I think back to when I was a student here at ENC, going around with a cappella. And then I've visited some of the churches in recent years as a missionary on home assignment from Africa. And all of the churches are lily white. And it makes me wonder, the communities aren't that way. Makes me wonder.
Do you think that the avoidance of talking about it has caused some members of the minority to not choose that church because they don't feel like they'd be welcome?
It's a different dynamic. It depends. And I think in some places, you go back to the old church growth principles that were in vogue back in the 80s, and the homogeneous unit principle. people go to church and worship in a place where they feel comfortable worshiping the way they do.
Mm-hmm.
I saw this in an African context, not based on race, but based on culture.
Mm-hmm.
The church that we attended was basically what we called or knew as a Shangan church. That was the local language that the service was conducted in.
Mm-hmm.
Now there were people who were there in the community who were of another culture,
Mm-hmm.
and they spoke another language. They could understand Shangan, but they didn't come to the Shangan service. They went to the service that spoke the language that they were comfortable with. And so that enters into it sometimes. I've been to some African American churches where I was the only white person there,
Mm-hmm.
and I was just welcomed with open arms.
Yeah.
And I've seen African Americans come to some white churches, and it's the same way. But on a long-term basis, I think people like, what I've observed is that people like to worship where they feel comfortable with that style of worship.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily a conscious segregation, it's just the way people are sometimes. Not that that's the way it should
Yeah.
be, but
Yeah. Do you think that avoiding the topic of racism in church can feed into stereotypes and prejudices that the congregation has in their day-to-day lives?
it could possibly, in places where racism is a very
Mm-hmm.
major problem. I think it needs to be addressed from the pulpit, and that's just one of the problems among many.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the more you talk about it, the more aware people become of the problem, and then can take action to deal with it and
Mm-hmm.
to eliminate as much of the prejudice as possible.
Can you think of any examples of negative side effects that stem from ignorance in the church, like maybe in the churches from like the Midwest where it was more segregated?
I can't think of anything specific, but I can foresee that there would be problems. I look back to when I was growing up as a kid. I grew up in
Mm-hmm.
northeastern Ohio in the 60s, and there were racial tensions then. And there were 5 Nazarene churches in the city where I was. There wasn't an African American in any of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I was a kid, and that's the way it was, and we didn't really think much about it.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back, I wish things had been different, but the whole country was in turmoil in those days. Now in the 70s, when I was here as at ENC, that's when we started to do things differently,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot more conscious mixing and active work going on that way.
So if pastors started talking about racism more, what do you think would happen? Would the congregation just be uncomfortable, or would it really change anything?
I think some would really have a change of heart if there was anti-racial or prejudicial feelings. That's not the way Christians are supposed to live and act.
Mm-hmm.
It's a case you get new light, you walk in the light.
Yeah.
Whether or not there is going to be an opportunity to put anything into practice is going to be another story. You look here on the South Shore, and different communities have different racial makeups.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go to some towns and you could be there a whole year and not encounter anyone of another racial group.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to put some of those things into
Yeah.
practice. Now, if you lived in Brockton, it would be another story, or in Randolph, and some of these, first towns outside of Boston. The communities are becoming more integrated and diverse. But the further south you go, the less of that you get.
Yeah. So, how have you seen the church reaching out and addressing this issue? And do you have any ideas of how they could do it
I
better?
haven't seen the church reaching out and addressing the issue. Now our church is rather unique.
Yeah.
But even in our church, that's very welcoming and more diverse than some churches in the Boston area.
Mm-hmm.
I've not seen a conscious